Mathias Cormann, welcome to Insiders.
Good morning.
Minister, consumers aren't spending, consumers aren't saving, productivity is down, wages are stagnant, confidence is down. Do you think the people at home watching feel or share your view that actually we're doing okay?
Well, the Australian economy continues to grow. We're in our 28th year of continuous growth, which of course is a longer period of uninterrupted growth than any other developed economy has been able to achieve.
It's pretty slow growth. It's the slowest in 10 years.
Well, it's 0.5% growth in the June quarter in the context of a global economy which has been weakening on the back of escalating global trade tensions. I mean, we've got to look at this in the broader context. You've got countries like, big trading nations like Germany and the UK going backwards. Singapore essentially delivering a negative quarter of growth, yet the Australian economy continues to grow.
Yes, but just on that, and the government's been making that comparison all week. I mean, take Britain. It's in the grip of Brexit. No wonder it's not firing on all cylinders. Australia, on the other hand, is benefiting to some degree from the US-China trade tensions. The iron ore sales are up. That's really boosted the coffers. I mean, we're improving the bottom line in this last year, not thanks to the government's policies.
Well, it is thanks to the government's policy. I mean, we're working to a plan. I mean, yes, of course. I mean, we are a trading economy and there has been a pickup in the resources sector, which has helped. There has been a stabilisation in the housing market, which has helped. But of course, and as the Governor of the Reserve Bank also has made very clear, he also expects growth to strengthen moving forward on the back of lower interest rates, our income tax cuts, and indeed, of course, a pickup in the resources sector, and also our exchange rate adjusting under our system through, as a floating exchange rate, which is also helping with our international competitiveness. But I mean, let's not kid ourselves. I mean, these are a pretty challenging This is a pretty challenging global economic environment. We have been dealing with the impact of a significant flood and drought in a domestic context, and all things considered, the fact that we continue to grow is an indication of the resilience of the Australian economy, and our employment growth is running at more than twice the rate across the OECD. We've got employment growth of 2.6%, above the long-term trend of 1.8%. We've got a record participation rate. I mean, essentially,
we've got high underemployment, and the unemployment rate isn't going down like the Reserve Bank would want it to.
More Australians in work than ever, 5.2% unemployment rate, which is well below where it was headed when we came into government. And, of course, there's more work to be done. And that is, of course, why we are implementing our plan to build a stronger economy, which includes more than $300 billion worth of income tax relief that we've legislated over the last 2 years, which came into effect from, of course, 1 July this year. About $15 billion worth of income tax refunds have been paid out since the legislation was passed by the Parliament, in that first sitting week in July.
And we'll have to wait and see, I suppose, how much of that gets spent back into the economy. Early signs are people weren't flooding out to the shops with their income tax checks. But I want to talk about infrastructure.
I think that is a bit too premature. I mean, I've heard.
Well, the July figures, the retail figures were down.
Well, indeed, and Jim Chalmers is always desperate to talk down the Australian economy. But let me tell you, it's quite premature to look at July retail figures to consider the impact of about $15 billion worth of income tax
I said let's wait and see.
Has been, indeed.
The government's been talking about infrastructure, so's the Reserve Bank Governor, who you mentioned earlier. The PM said this week that we're hitting our head on the ceiling in terms of capacity to build. The Reserve Bank Governor has, again this weekend, I'm quoting the Nine papers, saying, I think we can do more. Is the government, again, at odds with the Reserve Bank Governor? We have record low borrowing rates. Why does the government keep seemingly ignoring the advice of the Reserve Bank Governor?
Well, I completely reject that proposition. We're not at odds with the Reserve Bank Governor. Monetary policy and fiscal policy is heading in the same direction. We are
Can we do more on infrastructure than we are doing then?
We are doing more on infrastructure. I mean, we've significantly boosted our infrastructure investment pipeline in our most recent budget. we've boosted it to $100 billion, about half of which is to roll out over the current forward estimates period. We have a very substantial infrastructure investment plan. And as the Governor of the Reserve Bank has said on repeated occasions in the last month or two, he expects growth to strengthen into the future, including and in particular because of the continuing high investment in infrastructure. I think there are sections of the media that are quite desperate to talk up what they perceive to be changes in emphasis between the government and the Reserve Bank that are not actually there. There's a level of over-interpretation happening here that quite frankly completely overreaches.
Well, let me give you another quote from the Reserve Bank warning of downside risks, including the fallout from the US-China trade war. If that trade war escalates, what more can the government do to protect the economy against those downside risks? And will you forgo the surplus to do it?
Well, again, I mean, none of this is new. I mean, if you look at our budget papers
No, my question is, will you forgo the surplus to do it?
Well, no, well, if I may, you've asked the question, if I might answer it. So, I mean, this escalation in the US-China trade war, the global trade tensions, I mean, that is something that we knew about when we put our budget together, delivered on the 2nd of April.
Yes,
that is actually a downside risk. Well, that is a downside risk that is also pointed to in our budget papers. And our plan is actually framed to deal with all of these challenges that we're facing, to deal with the global economic headwinds that we're facing. That is why we have gone for another $158 billion worth of income tax relief. That is why we are boosting our infrastructure investment program.
So you won't need to risk that surplus. Is that what you're saying?
We are absolutely committed to our surplus. We are committed to making sure that government lives within its means. Labor, when they last went to government, put the country on more than a decade of deficit and debt. And you know, this is a very important part of our plan to build a stronger economy, to ensure that the government lives within its means, to ensure that future generations of Australians don't have to pay higher taxes to pay for our recurrent expenditure now. Very, very important that we live within our means and that the funding for our essential services that Australians rely on is on a fiscally sustainable basis and trajectory for the future.
Given the tepid rate of growth, given the headwinds we were just discussing, why won't the government consider lifting New Start? Even John Howard thinks you should lift New Start.
Well, New
is that
Start
just
allowance
about the surplus too, or is that something more punitive?
No, New Start allowance is increased twice a year by index. It's indexed twice a year. New Start allowance is indexed twice a year, as it has been for the last 25 years under governments of both political persuasions. That is the indexation that is applied to New Start allowance. New Start allowance is not a replacement wage. It's not an ongoing salary. This is meant to be transitional income support pending a return into employment.
Everyone understands that, but there's been pretty broad agreement across the business sector. As I say, even John Howard supports this, that it is too low.
Well, in the lead up to the last election, there were two alternative agendas, and neither party promised to increase New Start allowance. Labor went to the last election with $387 billion in higher taxes, and not a single cent of that $387 billion in higher taxes was allocated to an increase in New Start above the increase that happens twice a year.
But the Minister and the Prime Minister this week have just announced trying to reintroduce mandatory drug testing for welfare recipients instead. The Prime Minister says, quote, being on drugs stops you getting a job. Well, the BCA and ACOS both say the low rate of New Start is an impediment to getting a job too. The government's not budging on that.
Well, you know, we believe that the rate of New Start allowance is appropriate. I mean, that is obviously the judgment that we made at the budget. But we also believe that those Australians who are unemployed, who are on New Start, and who have a drug addiction problem, that this drug addiction problem is a barrier to them getting back into the workforce. And we're wanting to support and encourage Australians to deal with any barriers that they're facing in terms of getting back into the workforce. And that is, of course, why we believe that through this drug testing trial, that we should assess whether there's better ways to channel Australians into treatment to help them.
You believe that? There's no evidence to support that, though, is it, that it works?
Well, we're running a trial to build up the evidence. I mean, you know, we've of course run a trial in terms of the cashless debit card, and the cashless debit card trials are proving to be highly successful in bringing down the youth unemployment rate in particular, in bringing down the level of expenditure on drugs and gambling and alcohol.
Jackie Lambie has just secured a deal with the federal government to waive Tasmania's $157 million housing debt. You're the Finance Minister. I imagine you were involved in that. That was a deal struck in exchange for her vote for your tax cuts, the first round of tax cuts. Most of the other states have a housing debt too. I think the total is around $2 billion. Will you waive those as well?
Well, firstly, Senator Lambie made very clear in that first week in July that she was supporting our income tax relief plans on its own merits. She voted in favour of our legislation on its own merits. I said at the time that we obviously were aware that she felt very strongly about this issue and that we had committed to working with her and with the Tasmanian government through that issue in good faith. The Tasmanian government, indeed, the Hodgman Liberal government had lobbied the federal government in relation to this particular issue for some time as well. And so on a bilateral basis between the federal government and the Tasmanian government, we've been working through this issue over the last 8 weeks or so. If other state governments around Australia want to approach us with a view of reaching an overall agreement in relation to matters that are important to them, we're of course open to discussing these matters with them.
On this deal, $157 million to waive that debt for Tasmania in exchange for a vote on the tax cuts. Jackie Lambie basically says today she came too cheap and she won't be so cheap next time. How much would you be prepared to do for Tasmania in return for her vote on repealing Medivac, say, or ensuring integrity?
Let me be very clear. We will always deal with any issue on its own merits. The income tax plan was something that was very much in Australia's national interest. It was in the interest of working families around Australia. It was in the interest of our economy, and that is something that was legislated by the Parliament on its own merits. We've been engaging with Senator Lambie, as we said we would, in relation to the matter that you've now raised, and we've made a judgment that, based on all of the representations that we've received, that this was an appropriate thing to do. We will always consider very carefully on a case-by-case basis when representations are made to us whether they are appropriately supported and if they're consistent with the government's priorities and with the government's broader policy framework, then of course we'll engage in relation to these matters as appropriate.
And on the Medivac repeal bill, you're the leader of the government in the Senate. Will the government guarantee not to bring that bill in until the committee's done its work?
We don't have any plans of bringing this in this week. I've been, reading some comments. Otherwise, that is not something that I'm aware of.
And just finally, can I ask you, in terms of the Tamil family that's trying to avoid deportation to Sri Lanka, there's been a few leaks apparently coming from the government suggesting that if this family drops its legal appeals, goes home, then they can reapply to return on some kind of regional visa. They won't have to pay the debts they've incurred around deportation. They won't have to wait a year to reapply. Christina Keneally from Labor is calling on the government to guarantee those terms. Will the government guarantee that?
No. No. What the Prime Minister and Minister Dutton have said very clearly, and which is what would apply in this circumstance. Of course, if once they go back, they can apply for a visa in the appropriate way through the appropriate process.
But they have to pay over $1 million worth of repaying the deportation costs.
The law will apply to this family in the same way as it would apply to anybody else. You've got to remember there's about 1,500 Sri Lankans who were equally found not to be refugees, who have come here without a visa by boat, who have already been sent back. And there's absolutely no reason why this family should be treated any different. And it was none other than Anthony Albanese, who was a Deputy Prime Minister in 2013, made the point that no one who arrives without a visa by boat will ever be settled here in Australia. That's what he said in 2013 after those two individuals at the time arrived from Sri Lanka without a visa by boat.
Mathias Cormann, thank you very much for joining us on Insiders.
Always good to talk to you.